I would like to introduce our chair, Snježana-Prijić Samaržija, who will be moderating my lecture and Professor Miščević's lecture. So if you are all okay with this, I would like to begin. Snježana, can you take the word?
Thank you, Hana. Thank you, Hana. I would like at first to misuse my position of chair of the first session and to say hello to everybody. I'm so glad to see some of our old friends. Hello, Fabian, nice to see you. Nice to see you here, in this virtual area. Also, I would like to thank to the Center for Advanced Studies. I would like to thank to the Institute. Gazella, thank you very much. Hana, thank you very much. So from my position, and I'm sorry to misuse my position as director, I'm really, really so happy that we organize such a marvelous philosophical event with such a lot of participants, with such a great keynote speaker. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope that Professor Kasinka-san will join us soon. So I know Hana told me that we were in continuous contact with him. So I suppose it's just, what Hana said some misunderstanding of time. And definitely I'm very happy that I can announce the Hana, who actually organize, moderate us, for this conference. Thank you, Hana, very much. And her paper, her presentation titled as CONDORCET'S Jury Theorem in Contemporary Epistemic Circumstances. So Hana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Snježana. I will attempt to screen share, so you just give me a note whether it's working. Can you all see my screen, and which is currently unexciting, but
we see.
I'm opening PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay. So, of course, yeah.
Okay, this is. I'm hoping it will work. Play from start. My talk is titled "CONDORCET'S Jury Theorem in Contemporary Epistemic Circumstances," and the subtitle is "Incompetence, Dependence, and Insincerity," which just might be the predicament of contemporary majoritarian democracies. So first, I would like to announce the structure of the presentation. First, we will briefly consider what it is that makes a political system legitimate. What are the pre-requirements of democratic legitimacy? And here, of course, I'm relying on the vast legacy provided by primarily Fabian Peter. I will argue that a political system needs to be simultaneously politically and epistemically justified. So we will reconsider what is it that makes the system politically and epistemically justified. Secondly, we will assess the original assumptions of CONDORCET'S jury theorem, which are minimum competence, independence, and sincerity of the entire electorate. Then we will consider each presumption one by one. First, we will see whether competence turns to incompetence, whether independence turns to dependence, and whether sincerity turns to insincerity. Finally, we will consider some alternatives to majoritarian democratic systems, and also to deliberative democracy and to direct democracy. And I will briefly list my bibliography if somebody is interested in delving deeper into the topic. So first of all, what is it? Why isn't this moving? Just what is it that makes a system legitimate? To be legitimate, a political system must be both politically and epistemically justified, and political justification of democracy is relatively simple. So every single voter, regardless of their identity, meaning regardless of their gender, class belonging, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or religious belonging, must have an equal say in political decision-making, or in representative democracies, in electing decision makers. Epistemic justification, on the other hand, is more complex, meaning that to be epistemically justified, a political system must generate decisions of high epistemic quality. So We mean by this decisions that must be evidentially supported, truth conducive, backed by the best available scientific evidence, or that solve salient social problems. Most epistemic defenses of democracy rely on the framework provided by Condorcet's jury theorem. In essence, Condorcet's jury theorem, and here I am relying on Robert Godin and Kai Spiekerman's book, An Epistemic Theory of Democracy. It says two things: that the majority vote amongst a group of independent, minimally competent and sincere voters, each of whom is more likely to be right than random, is itself more likely to be right than any individual voter separately. Second, as the number of such voters approaches infinity, as is in large electorates, the probability that the majority among them is correct approaches certainty, or the value of 1. Condorcet's jury theorem, the setup. So the classic CET envisions a group of N voters making a choice between two alternatives, one of which matches the true state of the world, true majority rule. For convenience, N is assumed to be odd to avoid ties, and the entire setup can be extended to more than two alternatives to mimic actual political conditions. The Condorcet's jury theorem rests on 3 necessary assumptions. First, voters are minimally competent at gauging the correct alternative. They're independent of each other, meaning they don't just echo each other's opinions, and they all vote sincerely. As Godin and Spiekerman put it more strictly, competence means that each voter's belief about the correct alternative has the probability of p over 0.5, which means they're better than random. Independence, the beliefs of all voters are statistically independent given the true state of the world regarding the correct alternative, meaning voters do not just echo each other's judgment. And sincerity, all voters vote for the alternative they genuinely believe to be the correct alternative, meaning they do not vote strategically and they do not indulge in various game theoretic calculations. However, even if Condorcet's jury theorem functions in theory, does it work in practice? As we will see, there is reason to conclude that none of its assumptions hold in contemporary epistemic circumstances. Competence often ends as incompetence, independence is replaced by dependence, and sincerity gives way to strategic voting. In the original model, Condorcet assumed that a massive electorate composed of people just slightly better than random at gauging the correct alternative answer to a problem would be almost entirely certain to guess the truth through majority voting. In fact, as long as the majority of the voters are better than random, further improving their cognitive capacities through education has but a limited effect. And here I tried to model it, so it would look like this. Here we have an electorate of 10,000 people, and here we can see that as long as they're just slightly better than random, meaning as long as their probability of being correct exceeds 0.505, it makes relatively little difference whether they're 0.55% likely to be right or 0.6, because as long as they're very numerous, the likelihood of them being right approaches infinity, meaning 1. In the converse scenario, if we have an electorate of people who are worse than random, meaning whose probability of being right is, for example, 0.55, the more numerous they are, they're almost entirely certain to make the wrong decision. And here we can try to guess what the empirical evidence tells us. In his influential 1946 study of the American public called The Structure of Belief in Mass Publics, Philip Converse demonstrated that only roughly 12% of the electorate understands the left-right divide in politics and can assess political proposals in ideological terms. In the downbeat revision in 2006, Tabor and Lodge added that the minority that does understand politics then performs various mental gymnastics to stick with their current beliefs, rather than update their attitudes in line with current events. To make matters even worse, in 2003, Bartels added that citizens hold only immediate attitudes rather than actual preferences. he conducted various longitudinal studies of the way people feel about various salient social issues, and although they expressed immediate attitudes, these attitudes did not last through time, and they weren't coherent with the rest of their belief pool. In their now canonized 1996 study of the American public, Deli Carpini and Scott Keeter asked participants 2,000 survey questions that we would expect and informed citizens to know, including definitions of key terms such as liberal and conservative, constitutional values, concepts such as the Bill of Rights, prominent politicians' names, and key parties' positions on salient social topics. They found that only 4 in 10 questions could be answered correctly by the majority of those surveyed, while 1 in 4, including relevant party programs, which is what they're supposed to be voting for, could be answered by only 25% of the participants. However, much has changed since the advent of social networking, as we now face the additional problems of the post-truth era, such as fake news and misinformation. Due to the prevalence of misinformation, in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary nominated post-truth as the word of the year. Since then, evidence has shown that when individuals are presented both with a fact and a piece of misinformation about the same topic, the misinformation cancels out the fact. Van der Linden et al. In 2016 reviewed what happens when individuals are presented with correct information about climate change and a piece of misinformation that climate change is not real. And they found that individuals then have no change of beliefs, meaning that the fake information virtually cancels out the correct information. Similarly, mere exposure to conspiratorial discourse has been shown to make people less likely to accept official information, and ironically, correcting people's misinformed beliefs can make them even more confident of their present stance, particularly on impassioned partisan topics. And even if that were not so, ubiquitous identity prejudice and implicit biases regarding minority groups, amply discussed in debates on epistemic injustice, imply that citizens will collectively be worse than random regarding minority rights and electing minorities to public office. In conclusion, citizens largely do not understand the left-right divide, and the minority that does then becomes rigid and dogmatic regarding their current attitudes. Only 1 in 4 citizens is familiar with relevant party programs, current events, and the names of the people running their country. All citizens, including the minority that does understand politics, hold predominantly top-of-the-head attitudes rather than preferences that are stable through time. Citizens are often misinformed and, when corrected, do not come to believe the accurate fact, which is known as the continuous influence effect. Then the second assumption is the independence assumption, which serves to avoid cases of a single incompetent opinion leader, and here we can imagine Donald Trump, influencing millions of voters, which annuls the Condorcet's jury theorem and has us not dealing with many minds, but with one mind and many mimics. And here we can imagine 4 different cases, which are modeled in this graph. So the competent opinion leader means that there is just one relatively competent opinion leader who is 0.6 p likely to be right. And in this case, there is no aggregate effect, as everyone is just echoing the competent opinion leader. In the second case, we have an incompetent opinion leader, which means that, again, there is no Condorcet's jury theorem, is everybody is just echoing this one incompetent person. Case 1 is the usual optimistic Condorcet of people becoming more and more competent the more numbers we are. And case 2 is the pessimistic CT, which means that people just become less and less competent the more numerous they are. In fact, Condorcet's jury theorem has us imagine an electorate that is unburdened by the same opinion leaders, the same ideology, the same shared psychological mechanisms, such as heuristics and biases, the same social background, the same shared evidence or background information, and other voters. And I mean, even at this very point, it's entirely obvious that, of course, we will all be dependent on the same psychological mechanisms, such as heuristic and biases. And even besides from that, research suggests that we're quite susceptible to common knowledge, other voters, and influential opinion leaders. In 2017, Prelec and his collaborators illuminated the hegemony of common knowledge, which means that even when people form independent judgments, they're often working of the same publicly accessible information. In the end, the lowest common denominator accessible to all dominates over potentially more relevant expert knowledge. With the advent of social networking, something in the flow of information has gone additionally awry. Social network users are exposed to radically filtered information congruent with their present attitudes, with nothing to change their minds. And algorithmic filtering on the internet stimulates two different epistemic structures: epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. Since epistemic bubbles and echo chambers have different effects on our intellectual lives, they must be kept apart. First, just a minute. Epistemic bubbles are social epistemic structures where external voices are accidentally left out due to omission. Due to our choice of friends who share our values and trustworthy media that we have come to trust, as well as algorithmic filtering on social networks, we start lacking informational coverage from the rest of our epistemic community. Epistemic bubbles rest upon a phenomenon that is known as bootstrapped corroboration. We mistakenly perceive related sources of information as independent. In the converse effect, echo chambers are social epistemic structures where outside voices are actively discredited. While Wynne claims that echo chambers members come to doubt only the ethical nature of the outside world, it's reasonable to assume that they will become skeptical of their epistemic character as well. Echo chambers stem from preemptive evidencing. Charismatic individuals convince their followers that the outside world will attempt to deny their controversially true claims, so that once that indeed happens, they continue trusting them. While epistemic bubbles burst when confronted with opposing information, shattering echo chambers requires a social epistemic reboot, which would mean that echo chambers members would need to renew their trust in the outside world. In addition, the concept of an echo chamber helps us explain a wide range of phenomena, such as people ironically increasing their trust in a piece of misinformation when countered with a correction, and political polarization. And this is supposed to be Sunstein 2007 and Sunstein 2009. I just forgot to add it. Echo chambers can be found in everything from conspiracy theories and media audiences to political parties. The final assumption of Condorcet's jury theorem is sincerity. The CJT presupposes that voters vote sincerely, meaning that they vote for the option that they genuinely deem best, most truthful, or most likely to solve their problem. This assumption serves to preclude cases of voters voting strategically for an epistemically problematic lesser evil to prevent a party they especially dislike gaining traction, or indulging in game theoretic calculations. And here, I would like to refer to a very interesting 2018 study of Croatian youth. It seems that in societies riddled by corruption and political foul play, individuals will vote strategically for the party that controls most ministries and much of the public sector, as long as it employs someone that they're close to. In 2018, Vlasta Ilishin and her contributors analyzed the Croatian youth's trust in political institutions and came to a paradoxical discovery. Although young people's trust in political parties kept decreasing, more and more of them were joining them. In the 2013 survey, the number of Croatian adolescents who were members of a political party, 10.7%, was double the number that trusted political parties, which was 5%. In the same survey, young people underlined political suitability and personal relations as the key factors for attaining employment. Young people's motivation for joining political parties and then voting for them seems rather suspect. Likewise, in Croatia, the Croatian Democratic Union, which is the largest political party, is a party of 212,000 members that controls much of the public sector. In all public elections for the parliament since 2000, the CDU has been winning with exactly the same number of votes, 600,000. So it's reasonable to assume that most elections in Croatia in the last 20 years have been decided by CDU's members and their closest kin. In sum, it's not unreasonable to conclude that contemporary epistemic circumstances abolish all three presumptions of Condorcet's jury theorem: competence, independence, and sincerity. But if there's no epistemic justification for majoritarian democracy, what are our alternatives? Perhaps citizens should be tasked with making decisions about which they literally cannot be mistaken. Regardless of their individual competence, citizens cannot be wrong about their immediate living conditions, experiences of marginalization, desires, and priorities. Thus, citizens should be the ones who identify problems in their local community, rank them by salience, and monitor that the government has corrected them. It's worth inquiring how we can introduce expertise in the decision-making process without imperiling diversity's epistemic benefits. Experts are merely agents who have been trained in interpreting data and finding the best solutions to problems in their respective domain, and are thus more likely to produce high epistemic value decisions than agents who have not received such issue-specific training. It ought to be possible to distinguish merely reputational experts from genuine ones based on their academic achievements, predictive accuracy, and success in resolving problems related to their knowledge. While pure epistocracy or scholocracy is unacceptably undemocratic and lacks epistemic diversity, a division of epistemic labor between expert governments and citizens identifying problems seems to be more fruitful. If direct, representative, and deliberative democracy are untenable, as well as poor epistocracy or scholocracy, it might be worth exploring a division of decision-making epistemic labor between epistocratic central governments, strong local governments, and citizens partaking in local referenda. This is the literature I've been using, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Hana. Thank you for your presentation. I'm very happy that I can announce that Professor Kasim Kassam joined us. So we are give our hellos to him, but I propose to continue with the debate on Hana's presentation. So I would like to invite all of you to put the question. I'm just wondering if you could raise a hand, because I'm happy that I can say that 55 participants are there, so it will be easier that I to note the raised hand. So yeah, the floor is yours, but until we are waiting for potential questions, Hana, I have a kind of
have raised hands.
Sorry?
Ivan and Fabienne have raised hands.
Oh, sorry. So then I would like to leave the floor to Fabienne. So Fabienne, please. Sorry, I didn't.
Well, first of all, I want to say it's great to be here and see so many friends again, even if it's in this virtual environment. So thank you very much for inviting me. So Snježana in particular, hello. So Hana, I really enjoyed your talk. I think that was really clear, really well presented and convincing. I just had a question, which is a general question I often have about the application of the Condorcet jury theorem, is the interaction between the competence and the independence conditions. if I got you wrong when you discussed the competence condition, part of the problem you highlighted was the unwillingness of participants to update on receiving new information. Isn't there then a tension between what would be desirable from the competence point of view, namely that participants take on board information they receive from other citizens, informed experts, etc., and the independence condition?
Well, I'm pretty sure that the independence condition isn't supposed to be taken so literally. I mean, we all need to live with dependence, and it's obvious that we live in a social environment. So the independence condition merely is supposed to reflect the fact that citizens aren't just supposed to echo other people's political preferences. So I don't think that the independence condition is about it being forbidden for people to learn from experts. If they update their factual knowledge in virtue of other people's findings, that does not mean they're not independent. But if, for example, Donald Trump tells them that the election has been rigged and that everybody else is corrupt, with no evidence whatsoever supporting his claims, I believe that would violate the independence assumption. Whereas conversely, if somebody were to update their knowledge about, say, climate change in virtue of, for example, a meta-study averaging all findings on climate change, I believe they would still be independent, because they would still be making independent judgments in virtue of the best available evidence. I mean, that's at least how I read it, and that's a relatively, let's say, forgiving interpretation of Condorcet's jury theorem, because if we take the independence assumption to be so rigid, then it would be very difficult to imagine the Condorcet jury theorem working ever.
Yes, I mean, that sounds right. I suppose the problem comes in with testimony and what role testimony can play in relation to these two conditions, right? Independence and competence. Sometimes we rely on testimony to become more competent, but that could go against independence. And I particularly had the impression with regard to what you were saying, which was really interesting regarding minority groups, let's say claims about marginalization, right? We might want to take testimony on board here as a way of becoming more competent in relation to the circumstances of marginalized groups, but that could go against independence.
Well, yeah, I mean, most recent epistemic theories of democracy try to relax the independence assumption, because if we were really to understand independence as precluding the same heuristics, the same biases, and the same shared evidence, then nobody would ever be independent and the CJT would be hopeless. So I would absolutely allow for what you're saying, and obviously we need to take on the testimony of marginalized groups when learning about what constitutes our society. So I would agree with you. That's how that's the most optimistic interpretation of the CJT that's also completely valid.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Fabian. Thank you, Hana. Ivan Cerovac. So Ivan, yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I have actually a comment or a question that really follows up on what Fabian Peter said. I was writing it down and similar thought came to my mind. It's so, as I recall Condorcet jury theorem, the independence is usually said as defined not only as influential opinion makers affecting your opinions, but also depending on the same source of information or the same evidence, the same media, and so on. And I think I read somewhere something like, if evidence changes or if the source of information changes its content, then the opinions necessarily change. If that happens, then we have the dependence. Then we don't have independence anymore. And it seems to me that experts would then, but also the other sources of information like media and so on, they will undermine our independence. And I think that is one of the reasons why Condorcet's jury theorem is a very theoretical stuff and not really applied in practice. And now the question I actually have is, it's mostly from the perspective of ideal theory, but you earlier said that you're focusing on epistemic democracy and on majority rule within epistemic democracy. And then you proceed by talking about CONDORCET'S jury theorem. Nonetheless, this is typical for aggregative democracy, aggregative epistemic democracy. But it seems to me that it excludes deliberation. CONDORCET himself said that if citizens deliberate, then they are no longer independent. If they exchange reasons, then they are no longer independent. And of course, I know that you gave a lot of data about how citizens are unable to perceive reasons, unable to change their opinions in face of better reasons and so on. But it seems to me that first part of your presentation targets primarily aggregative democracy and not so much deliberative democracy, which I think many epistemic democrats favor.
That's true. I think the presentation would be kind of overwhelming if I were to include all of that. The problem with deliberative democracy is that the same predicaments of the post-truth society, such as echo chambers and epistemic bubbles, just make empirical deliberation very difficult, because as soon as somebody has entered, for example, an echo chamber, they automatically become sequestered from all opposing standpoints. Because if you believe that your in-group members are the only sole carriers of a controversial truth, you engaging in genuine deliberation just becomes very difficult. So I'm just uncertain, and the evidence makes me additionally uncertain that the current epistemic circumstances of spread political polarization are such that deliberative democracy is feasible. I mean, we would definitely need more empirical information, both of us, to, I think, adequately assess the potential of deliberative democracy, but there are some worries about the potential conflict between political polarization, belief polarization, dogmatism, which Professor Miščević will be talking about, and deliberative democracy.
Okay. Ivan, it's okay for you?
Sorry, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hana.
Thank you, Ivan. Now I invite Luigi Caranti for a questioning, Hana.
Yes, hi. First of all, I'd like to thank you for organizing this extremely interesting conference. I am a political philosopher. I teach at the University of Catania, and I've grown interested in these topics in the last years. And I have a question for Hana regarding the last part of her presentation, where she suggested this division of labor pretty much between common people and experts. I mean, you don't want epistocracy or any version of it on the one hand. You don't want direct democracy or not even representative democracy. It seemed, I think I understood that you were saying for the reasons that you gave in the first part of the presentation. And therefore, we have this division of labor. Now, question is simply, how different is this division of labor that you propose from representative democracies? As people as old as I am, I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember that democracy used to work in a different way compared to these populist times, in which there is this idea that anybody can do politics. Anybody can go to the parliament independently of the level of competence, independently of... So what was the way in which representative democracy, as it worked when I was truly young, worked? It was that there was the filter of parties, basically. So you had an agenda pretty much suggested by common people. These points that for which common people cared, were translated into a political process in which parties made of experts mainly, or at least relying on experts, would translate these inputs into something that would become ultimately a political decision. I mean, the latest developments of democracy seems to have gotten rid of this intermediate and so helpful and necessary step. So when you discard representative democracy, about which I have enormous doubts myself, but I think you should be careful not to be aware that you might be advocating precisely what democracy used to be 20 years ago, the time in which parties played a crucial role in filtering, reformulating, checking through experts, points that were suggested by the common people. So that's my question.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that luckily I'm not building the blocks of a new society. I'm just opening a topic. I have my doubts about representative democracy are solely because there seems to be, especially recently, the trend of political parties devolving into echo chambers. I mean, this is, for example, particularly evident in American politics, which is notoriously bipartisan, where you have completely polarized factions that have very little communication between each other, and which gradually seem to be moving to the right. And especially, most of us here have the experience of post-socialist regimes in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, where political parties simply mostly do not have this expert component of filtering through information and offering the best available outcomes and the best available evidence-based results. So I'm just trying to consider what would happen, and would it be easier for citizens to deliberate without the mediation of partisanship? And this is something that I would like to explore and that I intend to explore further into the future. So it's just a potential idea, because what populism annuls is the impact of expertise and of evidence on politics. And populism is the exact opposition of evidence-based politics. Extremism is the exact opposition of evidence-based politics. So that is something, it's a topic that I would like to open. I have no conclusive results. I'm not trying to convince you that representative democracy is bad. I'm not sure myself. I'm just trying to consider potential reformulations that could save democracy and that could improve its epistemic effects through some small modifications, if that's okay as an answer.
Luigi, is okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Luigi. Thank you, Hana. Thank Fabienne and Ivan. So I think that we use our time for the Hana's presentation.
Okay, so my title is Social Epistemic Sloth, Dogmatism Against Democracy. The area where is opposing to democracy will be the area of populism. So to narrow down the thing, I would assume that populism is a very strong movement that goes, especially right-wing populism, it goes against reasonable democratic deliberation. And our guests here, most of our guests have in their countries examples of things like Brexit, people like Trump. But, you know, I want to be proud of my country, of my several countries. We have our specialties. You know, when you have guests, you have to offer them the home specialties. In Croatia, Slovenia and Hungary, my three countries, populists claim normally that Muslim refugees are conquering Christian territories, and they are doing it for a future Muslim empire. So this is a crazy, of course, crazy view. Kasim would certainly have some story about how we can make sense of it. It will be very difficult, very, very difficult. It's a demanding task. Fortunately, I don't have to do it. So I will use example from the populist right-wing journal Democracy in Slovenia. When they present the Marrakesh Compact, they come with historic association, and this is association to 5 Christian martyrs who were, luckily, from Marrakesh. No, sorry, they were not from Marrakesh, who were in Marrakesh, early 13th century, this 12,020, and they were killed by the Muslim ruler then, the ruler of Morocco. And what Democracy wants to have, the journal, what they want to do is, Marrakesh Compact has come out with positive stuff about refugees. And now they say, well, you know, the association you should have with Marrakesh is that this is the place where our Christian preachers, they were tortured and they became martyrs. So that's the picture. That's a kind of nice populist trick. Democracy has more. So here is a picture. Here is the front page of Democracy. You can see this woman being undressed by dark hands. It's important that the hands are dark and that she is very white and very blonde. The title is Culture of Rape. And the text is, with the migrants in Slovenia comes the culture of rape. How would the average Slovenian react to this kind of picture? This is the important thing. How would he deliberate? So here I am assuming that the average reader is relatively stupid. So I am calling him he. I think this is politically correct. I'll talk about these stupid readers using the masculine pronoun. So how would he deliberate about the treatment of refugees if he is getting these kinds of associations? Or what kind of deliberation of his representatives would he endorse? On the other hand, instead of this kind of artificial photos, you've got tons of typical realistic photos like the one at the bottom of the page of the slide. Why is not the reader reacting to these typical realistic photos? This woman doesn't look like a Muslim conqueror whose goal is to come and rape the Slovenes. This is what the populist rhetoric is like. I will be using this as my favorite example. So here is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about one particular epistemic vice. I will call it sloth, following a long tradition. And I will claim that it is a typical populist vice. And so first, let me see what I mean by sloth. I take it in a very general meaning. I take it to be just generally the epistemic vice that demotivates us to go and learn something. It's the opposite of curiosity. It's really a kind of negative counterpart of curiosity. There is a richness of subtle proposals about different subkinds, subspecies of this general phenomenon. Kassan has this nice paper on epistemic insouciance. And I would say, yes, that's one version of this is one version of the vice of sloth. But what we need is a kind of general category for this widest kind of demotivating epistemic vice. I will write e-vice. And so I propose to use sloth or epistemic sloth. It will be wider than those interesting examples found in the literature. For example, Kassam has epistemic insouciance, Heather Bataille has being a slacker, and so on and so on. And so I would say insouciance and being a slacker and having of other similar epistemic defects, they would be subspecies, various subspecies of sloth in this widest possible sense of the word. I want to note that there will be various kinds of sloth. I would like to stress two kinds. One would be more inertial. So somebody being just lazy to think about something, lazy to accept. It's a passive sloth in a very wide sense of passive. I call it inertial. The other kind is self-assertive variety. Both can be individual or collective. We'll come to this in a second. Self-assertive variety is, of course, saying, I don't want to think different. I don't want to reflect about this. So very often I can have a prejudgment, as Miranda Fricker would call it. I could have a prejudgment, and I'm just too lazy, although my surrounding is pointing to me, look, there are reasons not to have this prejudgment. I might be too lazy and I might reject it in a very active way. So this I would call self-assertive variety of sloth. And to return to Kassam's terminology, he distinguishes policies and postures. The posture is more general, doesn't have to be emotional, and so on. But I would say that, for example, the self-assertive varieties can consist of a policy rather than of a posture. They can be voluntarily adopted epistemic attitudes with an affective component. Please don't push me to think about this. I just don't want to think about this alternative. Or it can be without it. Please don't remind me of these things. I don't see any point in being reminded. No affective component, but I just refuse to think. I just refuse any kind of curiosity about the alternative. So these are the options. We can systematize this here. So you will have each of these can be, of course, individual, or it can be collective. I just described and gave examples of individual ordinary laziness, which is this kind of inertial individual sloth. And I gave example of individual dogmatism, sticking to one's opinion, just with not wanting, intensely not wanting to consider alternatives, to think about other possibilities, and so on. I didn't talk about collective variants. Let me mention for the collective, let me mention that Miranda Fricker, in her paper that has inferential inertia in its title, Miranda describes a phenomenon which she calls inferential inertia, which consists of the following. I might have in the different modules of my mind, different baskets in my brain, I might have different information and different beliefs, but I don't want to connect them because I am too lazy. Now we can imagine the same thing socially. So what can happen is that here we have a group, say from my town, from Rijeka, and each of us has some amount of knowledge about a given topic, but we are too inert to come and sit down and just infer commonly infer the consequences of this. Miranda Fricker calls this inferential inertia. This is just not doing it, being too lazy to do it. Or you can go, a collective can go self-assertive, and then you have this thing of group dogmatism, which parallels individual dogmatism. Somebody might say, well, Nenad, you call these self-assertive kinds of laziness, you call them dogmatism, but doesn't dogmatism require more than mere sloth? I would say that it's possible, not that it requires, but that it goes very often with more than mere sloth. It can go with arrogance, it can go with being too sure of oneself, the lack of epistemic humility, and so on. But when I say here sloth, it's not mere, it's really assertive sloth. Sloth is usually seen as a phenomenon of total passivity, as a phenomenon of lack of motivation to investigate. But one can think, and I would like to ask you to do this, of a more active version of sloth, an active refusal to question and investigate. Understood in this active wider sense, with a passive component and an active component, sloth is the cornerstone of epistemic dogmatism, and dogmatism can encompass other things, can encompass other vices, but I would think that sloth, the self-assertive sloth, is the cornerstone. Okay, so I would say that dogmatism is probably responsible for blocking central epistemic motivation of epistemic discussion and deliberation. Here I would like to borrow from Dan Sperber something that I've been discussing with him in his seminars quite a lot. The idea is that average human can be intellectually vigilant, no problem with this, but he is intellectually vigilant only in facing others from which he distances himself. And when facing one's own group, we might hypothesize that he stops being vigilant. The presence of one's in-group is a further motive for social dogmatism with all its catastrophic political consequences. So this might be the one interesting relation between individual and collective sloth. But there might be a wider structural picture at our curiosity. Since the sloth is the opposite of curiosity, which is the central motivating epistemic virtue, one might see sloth as its contrary, a central demotivating vice, the very pillar of the culture of ignorance. I apologize for referring to my own work. I just published few months ago, I published a book on curiosity in Macmillan. Its title is Curiosity, the Central Epistemic Vice, Central Epistemic Virtue. So I take motivation in the book. I show how curiosity motivates our thinking, our research, and so on. I want to do now the same thing for sloth, show how sloth demotivates all that, and use it then also in political examples for this thing that we are all now commonly doing together. This brings us to my central argument about sloth. I call it master argument. It is epistemically very important to be intrinsically motivated to acquire knowledge and understanding. Since most of the character virtues apart from curiosity, do not motivate such acquisition. The lack of curiosity, the epistemic sloth, will block the acquisition of knowledge and understanding. Of course, if you look at virtues, you can have disabilities, you can have character traits and so on. Disabilities are not demotivating in themselves. They might block realization of the goals we are independently motivated to achieve. Other epistemic vices do not target curiosity directly and centrally, say arrogance or lack of humility. So the genuine epistemic sloth, this is what remains, is the central, intrinsically demotivating factor blocking the achievement of knowledge and understanding. And of course, it can do it, and usually does it in cooperation with other vices, as the classics would insist. Classics insist on some sort of unity, of mutual support, of epistemic virtues, and the opposite, mutual support of various epistemic vices. So, if sloth is an epistemic vice, which I think it is the central, cognitively demotivating vice. Now, it seems that a central demotivating vice would be basic for the whole system of epistemic vices. If this seeming is correct, we can appeal to the fact that epistemic sloth is an epistemic vice and conclude that it is a central epistemic vice, a threat to the whole cognitive enterprise. That's my main conclusion about the nature, the role of sloth. But now we have a more difficult, deeper question to face, and this is what is precisely the connection about this demotivational work and other epistemic vices. So if motivational element, in the case of vice, the demotivating force, is so important for the archetypic result, the result concerning vice in this case, what then is the relation between the central demotivating vice and other vices? We have the same symmetric question with curiosity. If curiosity is the central motivating epistemic virtue, what is its relation to other epistemic virtues? So you have the whole system in front of your eyes. And here I can see, without much thinking, I can see three principled options. There might be more. One is that bad motivation is constitutive of vice, and it's an essential part of it. I can call it then constitutivism. The symmetrically good motivation is constitutive of virtue. Jason Baer is saying this explicitly. I think Heather, in her book of virtue, she almost explicitly says the same thing, and there are others. There is another more subtle possibility, which I call immanentism, namely that bad motivation is internally connected to the vice. It is an intrinsic relation, but it's not identity, it's not parthood. It is an intrinsic relation, but still preserving the distinction between the rest of the given vice and the bad motivation. Presupposition for this, of course, is a strong holism on vice and of virtue, that you can't have a virtue, say, whatever, epistemic insightfulness without positive epistemic motivation, without curiosity. The same thing for the vice. You can't have an epistemic vice without having also the motive, although the two, they are not part and whole, they are just internally, intrinsically connected. It's the most complicated variant. The third is, again, simple, like the first, and this is separatism. Bad motivation is independent from the nature of vice, although bad motives are normally accompanying vice. And I've taken Kassam's text at the beginning of his book as an instance of this, of separatism. So I'm quite tempted with this complicated option, internal constitutive connection, but I prefer to be cautious, and I would prefer to join Kassam in affirming the essential conceptual independence. And here is the quotation from page 5 of Kassam's Vices of the Mind. Epistemic vices aren't rooted in a desire for ignorance and neither have epistemic motives that account for the badness. For obstructivism, epistemic vices don't have to have bad motives and aren't vices because they have bad motives. Kassim is describing this as a kind of consequentialism. When we look at a vice, we look at its bad epistemic consequences. For me, it's quite acceptable because originally I came from the tradition of Sosa, and I was more into this truth-related definition of virtue and vice. And here I see a nice way to combine the character story and the truth story. So this is the option that I would choose. This third way allows for supreme importance of sloth for other epistemic vices, but the importance is contingent and it's not constitutive or essential or conceptual connection. Okay, so much for theoretical issues. Sadly, I have to jump to politics a little bit. So back to applied to political vice epistemology. Andrew Aberdeen has this paper, Populism and the Virtues of Argument, and in the abstract, he says that several factors to which the rise of populism has been attributed may be understood as arising from vices of argumentation, including arrogance, emulousness, and insouciance. And conversely, of course, virtues could give a constructive response. They can be a therapy for populism. He appeals to Kassam, to his link of insouciance and populism, as Kassam links insouciance directly to populism by illustrating his account with a familiar quotation from British politician Michael Gove, quotation which is often interpreted as an overt appeal to populism. Gove famously remarked that, he says, "I think that people in this country have had enough of experts from organizations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong." So this brings me to the last brief part of the talk. This will make you happy. The mentioning of insouciance brings us to vices of sloth, both inertial and self-assertive in their role. The populist argumentation, one finds a lot of appeal to prejudgment, judgment made or maintained without proper regard for the evidence, first on the side of arguer and second on the side of the listener. So to return to my example at the beginning, the Slovenian journal Democracy take the idea that Muslims are aggressive and dangerous, they hate us who are members of Christian civilization. Well, the inertial sloth will prompt the reader of the journal of Democracia to accept the accusation against Muslim migrants without questioning them. This kind of small antipathy to the Muslim tradition. It is present in our countries since the time of the wars with Turks, and it's there, it's sitting there. If you are completely inertial and you get the journal saying, yes, this is what they are, they want to conquer our country, they want to become our masters, they want to exterminate Christianity, the inertial sloth might prompt you to say, yeah, that's what I always thought. The self-assertive sloth will, of course, govern the practice of the people who wrote this, and the editor of the Journal of Democracia. There you will get a kind of active, aggressive, let me push for not changing this opinion. The same goes with the perverting of democratic with the generalization. It's the picture I've shown you. Dark-skinned refugees are rapists. Of course, arrogance and emulousness then jump in and strengthen the attitudes and practices involved. Epistemic vices make a caricature of democratic deliberation. Let's stay with our example and consider the ways the trusting reader of the journal would deliberate about refugees and how he would treat others deliberating on the same topic. So you got these pictures against Marrakesh Compact. And here is Marrakesh Compact advises about movement of refugees. What should be done is strengthen international cooperation and global partnership for safe, ordinary and regular migration and provide access to basic services for migrants. Now, what would the populists in our countries, yours and mine, say? Well, the answer is clear. Safe, orderly and regular migration is not needed and is anyway impossible. Second, as far as services go, the refugees, they don't deserve any basic services. And often this will have the status of a prejudgment accepted partly or fully from inertial sloth and maintained out of a self-assertive sloth. Such judgments, of course, have dire consequences. We have on the Croatian-Bosnian border, we have an area where refugees come when they want to get to the European Union. And for months, there are no doctors in this area. The country, Bosnia, is just not sending any doctors. Croatia is saying, oh, this is Bosnia, we don't have to do it. So nobody is saying sending doctors, and refugees are dying of sicknesses. Now has come the coronavirus. So it's getting worse and worse. And this is the implementation of this idea that they don't deserve any basic services. This then becomes a killing threat, a killing idea. Democratic deliberation, of course, essentially depends on the rationality of active deliberators and the rationality of the audience. So we can conclude with this. Our question was how important are vices of sloth, both inertial and self-assertive, in particular in populist argumentation. It looks like they are quite important, and looks that populist practices are extremely rich with this and other epistemic vices. Our presentation, this short thing, is just a brief introduction to this wide area, and much more work is nowadays being done and has yet to be done on the topic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nenad. Thank you, Nenad. Please, could you quit your sharing the screen? So I would like to invite all of you for a discussion. As I see, we have Hana. You have first raising hand, so please.
Okay, thank you for your lecture. It was fascinating. So how would you suggest we counter self-assertive sloth in people who abide by populist politics, who believe populist politics, and who then choose to side with populist politics? So you have shown quite convincingly that the very articulation of populist politics depends on self-assertive Sloth, but it could also be argued that the entire electorate, which then respects it and abides by it, also exhibits epistemic vices. So how do you suggest we counter them?
How do I suggest what?
Counter them. How do we discourage Sloth in the electorate?
Oh, this is a question that's almost impossible to answer. It's a very, very difficult question because the audiences, our audiences that we know in these countries, they are very dogmatic. So what can be done? It's hard to say. I think we need what is good to have at this moment is a brave engagement of the media. So let me give you just one example. In Slovenia, you have a newspaper journalist who is completely crazy, who goes to Syria and to Iraq, and he's living on the Iraqi-Syrian border, talking to people, and each week sending some material. So he's really all the time, he's risking his life because he's attacking the ISIL, the Daesh, and he's sitting there. He doesn't want to come home to Ljubljana. And the result is that the Slovenian daily, Delo, has this incredible source of nice, positive information about the ordinary Arab population. Now, I suppose if we had like 30 heroes like this would be helpful. But how do you produce 30 heroes? God knows. Let me give you another example. When the refugees came for the first time to my town, to Maribor, the students plus one teacher, Klamfer, organized collecting things for them. And mostly it was clothes. So I brought tons of old clothes that I had in Maribor, that I wouldn't bring home because my wife would criticize me, and I was kind of didn't feel like throwing it away, so I was keeping it in Maribor. It was piling there, and then I brought this huge pile to these students, the girls who were collecting it for the refugees. And the girl took the shoe and she started looking at it. She says, yeah, you know, this shoe is not too solid. There might be a small hole, you know, it's not good for the, and I said, well, look, you know, I'm full professor. If a full professor can wear this at his job, how come that Afghan refugee who is cold and hungry can't wear the same shoes? And we started quarreling. And after 5 minutes of quarreling, I realized that they are speaking about these refugees as if they were their children. Because the kind of care that a mother would have for her own child when choosing these clothes. And I would say this is what we need. This is what should become more general.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Nenad. So, Kasim Kassam, Professor Kassam, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. That was really, really great. I just wanted to ask you about an expression that you used in the paper, which is populist argumentation. So my question is populist argumentation just argumentation in favor of populist views, or is it a particular type of argumentation distinguished by particular epistemic vices? Because somebody might say that on the latter interpretation, that, I mean, there's no reason to suppose that populists are any more epistemically vicious than anyone else, or at least that's a question that would need to be addressed. I mean, so if you think about, you know, refusal to question and investigate I mean, are they any more prone to that than the rest of us? I mean, are anti-populists any more willing to question and investigate their own positions than populists are? So I suppose my question is really whether you think in the end it's actually helpful to think about populism or arguments for populism in terms of some distinctive set of epistemic vices that they exemplify.
Okay, thanks a lot for the question. The spirit of your question is very much, it reminds me very much on your work on conspiracy theories, where you try to show that there is there is a social intellectual kind of theories that are conspiracy theories, and that's it. And I would very much assume that it would be very nice to do the same thing for populist argumentation. And the only way I can respect your question as it merits is, I will do it now, is to promise to do it. I'll really look at the specificities. I didn't. I just gave examples that were closest to me. But this is something, this is a very nice plan, actually, what to do about populist argumentation. See, is there this characterizing trait? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Anna Martin is next. Yeah, Anna, please.
Thank you very much. Great talks. A very interesting conference. Thanks, Hana, for organizing and inviting. I am a political scientist. I'm a political theorist, political scientist. I'm not a philosopher.
Oh, come on, so, Anna, you are a philosopher.
No. But so this is to explain my question. For both Professor Miščević and Professor Kasim, you're both talking about argumentation, narratives, how to counter this narrative with that narrative. But I think what is missing in the picture is questions of power, because all these narratives are connected with the idea that somebody should be in power or should not be in power. And it is also connected to what Hana was talking about, legitimacy in the first talk. So if you can comment a little bit on how to square, or can you put into your picture or into your conception this aspect of power and integrate it and see if that maybe gives some more light on what's going on? Because I think without putting this thing into the picture, we are missing a lot and we cannot understand much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I like the question very much. It's a kind of typical leftist worry from Marx to Foucault. If you encounter a piece of bullshit, and then the first question is, what is the relation of this bullshit with power? So, and since I'm on the left, I believe that the question is legitimate and that it's deeply important. It would demand, to answer the question, one should go to the power ambitions of populism. I'm kind of obsessed with the right-wing populism. I think it's different from the left-wing. I think the Chantal Mouffe and these left-wing populist theories that this is not real deep populism. So I would look at the right okay. So we should then first think about, okay, what is the type of power that the populist is defending? What is the type of power that he wants to propose and to impose. And they say, well, once we have this, suppose to say, okay, suppose it's a kind of power of the leader, power of one person with no intermediaries. There is a leader, and then there are the faithful followers. If that's the structure, wouldn't sloth be a perfect virtue?
Yeah.
Perfect political virtue, to build and to implement this kind of power, this kind of rule. So this is the direction in which I would go. And thank you very much for the question.
Okay, thanks to all of you.